How are you, folks? Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. Several months ago, I made a video talking about the different ways that this Russia Ukraine war could come to an end. And I provided four scenarios. The first one being that Russia wins. And I said, I think it's about a 40% chance that Russia wins. And then I said 30% chance this conflict turns into a stalemate. There's no official end, and it's like a situation with North Korea and South Korea. And then I said there was about a 20% chance that NATO could get involved, and that would be a doomsday scenario. NATO direct involvement, obviously, the threat of nuclear war. And very kindly, I said that there was about a 10% chance that Ukraine could win. And 10% was way too high. It's probably closer to 5%, 3%, something like that. But those were the four scenarios I provided. Now, since Bakhmut has fallen, we're in this position now where what is going to come next? Which scenario is most likely? Now, clearly, Russia has the advantage right now, but I want to look at things from the perspective of the think tanks in the United States. And of course, one of my go tos to get information to see what the elites, the neocons, are thinking is Rand Corporation. Now, back in December 2022, the Rand Corporation released a paper, and this paper is called, one second, this paper is called Avoiding a Long War, U.S. Policy and the Trajectory of the Russia Ukraine Conflict. Now, like myself, they provided a few scenarios for how this war ends. And I wanted to go through these scenarios so you could see what they're thinking in Washington, D.C., and then make my own comments at the end because they talk about implications for U.S. policy and how it's going to affect us generally. Now, the first scenario, as they call war termination, is absolute victory. So, what do they say here? Um, One form of war termination is absolute victory. This outcome involves one state permanently removing the threat posed by its adversary. Absolute victory, as Dan Rader notes, can be accomplished through the victor installing a new leadership in the defeated state, occupying or annexing the adversary's territory, or at worst, annihilating the adversary's entire population. Although it might entail an agreement, an absolute victory's defining feature is a war outcome that essentially removes the possibility of the defeated state reneging on a war ending settlement. This is the type of victory that the Allies achieved over Japan and Germany at the end of World War II. When the war began, Moscow appeared to be seeking an absolute victory with plans to install a new regime in Kiev and demilitarize the country. Since abandoning its attempt to take the capital in early April, Russia appears to have scuttled these plans. Putin's declared aims have varied over time since then, but at no point in recent months has he or his ministers repeated the direct calls um, to overthrow the government in Kiev issued in the early weeks of the war. Although some allege that Moscow has not given up on its initial ambitious goals, even if the Kremlin still inspired to impose an absolute victory, facts on the ground indicate that it would not be able to do so. As of this writing, this is back in December, Moscow's primary goal seems to be holding onto territory in the four Ukraine regions that Russia now claims as its own. But even if Russia took and held these regions, that would hardly be an absolute victory. It would have to effect a fundamental change in Ukraine's political system, such as ousting President Zelensky to achieve absolute victory. But Ukraine's system of government is now more firmly anchored than it was before the war. Russia's brutal tactics have repelled even those Ukrainians who harbored pro Russian sympathies, and Zelensky is immensely popular. Now, that, again, this is back in December, that could be changing. Right now, I would say his popularity isn't quite what it was back then. Moreover, the Ukrainian military, with its current capabilities, could pose a threat to Russian occupied areas or even the bordering areas of undisputed Russian territory indefinitely. Now, they describe an absolute victory for Ukraine, which again is probably not going to happen. This was 6 months ago. Bakhmut falls. They had the failed raid of Belgorod. Ukraine's not going to get an absolute victory, but they at least talk about it here. An absolute Ukrainian victory is also unlikely. Ukraine has never really officially proclaimed an intention to achieve an absolute victory, as the literature defines it. President Zelensky's declared objectives have changed over time, but as of December 2022, his stated goal is to retake all of Ukraine's territory, including Crimea and the areas of the Donbass that Russia has occupied since 2014. So I'll stop there. That's not going to happen. They're not going to have absolute victory. So no use in focusing on that too much. Now, where it gets interesting is armistice agreements. What happens if there's no absolute victory and there's some sort of, complete, or not complete, but a political settlement, or is there going to be a situation like North and South Korea where there's no official end to the war, but there is a ceasefire? And here's what it says. In armistice agreements like those that ended the Korean War in 1953 and the Transnistria conflict in Moldova in 1992, the two sides commit to stop fighting and often create mechanisms such as demilitarized zones to prevent the resumption of violence. Although armistice agreements can be quite detailed, the Korean agreement was nearly 40 pages long, they generally do not address the political drivers of the conflict, which means tensions can endure and a diplomatic and economic relations between the parties often remain at a minimal level. Armistice agreements that have mechanisms for monitoring and ensuring compliance to reduce the risk of conflict resuming are more durable than those that do not. An armistice in Ukraine would freeze the front lines and bring a long-term end to active combat. Russia would stop attempts to occupy additional Ukrainian territory and cease missile strikes on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Ukrainian forces would stop their counteroffensives, strikes on Russian-held areas of Ukraine and on Russia itself. There would still be ongoing unresolved territorial disputes, that is, divergent opinions or positions on the location of Ukraine's borders between Kiev and Moscow. These would be contested politically and economically, not militarily. The key political issues beyond territorial control, ranging from Russian payments or payment of reparations to Ukraine's geopolitical status, would remain unaddressed. The sides would likely conduct only minimal trade. The borders would be largely closed. The line of control would likely become highly militarized, like the inner German border during the Cold War. Now, the longer things go, that scenario, I think, is more and more likely. Now, you can also have political settlement. And the sad thing here is that after the invasion, even before the invasion, there were overtures by Putin to try to have some sort of arrangement. And originally, that was the Minsk agreements to not have violence. And the West repeatedly has encouraged Ukraine not to sit down and negotiate. But again, after the war started, back in May 2022, April 2022, there was negotiations, and then uh, Boris Johnson from England flew in, talked to Zelensky, and all of a sudden, all the negotiations broke off, and now we've had another year of war, and countless obviously have died because an agreement was not reached. So, political settlement would be great, but clearly the West is not very interested. But according to RAND, that would be the best outcome. And they say a political settlement or peace treaty would involve both a durable ceasefire and a resolution of at least some of the disputes that sparked the war or emerged during it. Since 1946, peace treaties have been less common than armistice agreements, but they tend to produce a durable end to fighting and reduction in tensions. In the case of the Russian-Ukraine war, a settlement would entail negotiated compromise on some of the core political issues at stake for the two sides. That's what we need, but I'm not sure, again, that we're going to get this. Now, here's what they say about implications for U.S. interest, and here's where I'm going to disagree with RAND. They say, since an absolute victory is highly unlikely, there will probably be a negotiated end to the Russia-Ukraine war at some point. But given current trends, the prospects for such an agreement are poor in the near term, as we discussed in the following sections. A political settlement might be more difficult to reach than an armistice agreement, since the latter would be narrowly focused on maintaining a ceasefire, not resolving the increasingly deep and broad set of issues disputed between Ukraine and Russia. I'll skip down to the last paragraph. Therefore, other things being equal, U.S. interests are better served by a political settlement that might bring a more durable peace than an armistice. Now, I absolutely disagree. I do not think the United States wants a negotiated settlement for several reasons. One is, well, if there was a negotiated settlement, what would the point of the entire war have been? We said we were trying to have this war to protect the Ukraine's borders and their freedoms and to push back the Russians, to contain them. If there is a negotiated settlement and Russia gets these four new provinces, keeps Crimea, and then they reopen their economic relations with Europe, well, that's in a sense, I mean, they say that's not complete victory, but that's what they wanted in the first place. And so, what would the whole point of this exercise have been? This will make the United States look terrible. And now everybody will say, so we have, 300,000 dead Russians and Ukrainians. If Russia got what it wanted anyway, and then we have a peace agreement and we all just go back to, business as usual, it would make the neocons look foolish. And again, U.S. interest, it's really about neocon interest. That's the issue here. So I just don't see that happening. And also, I've made the point in the past that we're actually trying to get that stalemate, that situation where there's no clear winner. And why do I say that? I talk about in other videos the slow escalation. Over the last year, we say, oh, we're not going to give you that. And then we change our mind. And we keep on doing that. So, for example, F-16s, April 2022, we're not going to give you F-16s. That's not going to happen. Oh, look at this. Ooh, U.S. and its allies plan to provide Ukraine with F-16s. Why the U.S. won't give Patriot interceptors to Ukraine back in March 2022. Oh, look, U.S.-made Patriot guided missile systems have arrived in Ukraine. And then missiles Ukraine wants, but the U.S. says they don't need long-range missiles. Oh, look at this. Britain has delivered long-range missiles to Ukraine. So what are we doing? Are we trying to help the Ukrainians win? Or are we piecemeal giving them just enough to stay in the fight, to keep things sort of deadlocked? I think that's what we're doing. if our whole thing was let's have Ukraine win, I think we would have done a much more for them a long time ago, rather than over the last year, give them a little bit, give them a little bit, give them a little bit, and just do enough to keep them in the fight. Tell them not to negotiate, so we can, as we stated in the past on several occasions, so we can hurt Russia, weaken Russia. That is our ultimate goal. Not trying to find a peace solution. Come on now. I mean, understand the neocons and what they do. So they're not looking for that peace. They want to hurt Russia. If they can't beat Russia, then they're going to do what they can to just gum up the works. And I think that's at the goal here is to cause some sort of eventually, the fighting will stop, but not an agreement. It'll be a stalemate. It'll be a demilitarized zone, and they want to keep Russia economically in the future separated from Europe. They can't have that gas starting to flow back into Germany and the resumption of normal relations. So if they can't beat them, the second best thing for the neocons is to keep them economically isolated from the West, keep them in a situation where they have permanent tension on their border, where there's, if there's a ceasefire, you're still going to have nationalists on the Ukrainian side doing border raids and terrorist attacks. And just it will cause long-term instability around the Russian border and keep Russia, in a situation where they're always distracted by this conflict in Ukraine that never goes away, and it'll be a thorn in their side. So I think that is the goal of the U.S. now. Keep Ukraine hanging around, so that things don't progress that much, and then keep Russia economically sealed off from the West. And maybe if some of these dreamers and these neocon think tanks, maybe over time this will weaken Vladimir Putin and get him out of power, because of course that's what they really want. They want Vladimir Putin out of power. Oh Christ, that would be their Christmas, Easter, and everything all rolled into one if Putin was gone. And maybe over time, long-term strategy of just sort of chaos in Ukraine perhaps could do that. So I think that is the goal. Rand, though, does provide a reasonable scenarios here as far as what could happen, but they are 100% wrong about the United States wanting a negotiated settlement that brings both sides together and resumes normal economic activity with Russia and the West. They do not want that. And at this point, a year into the conflict, well over a year, so many things have been said and done that I do think is impossible. Now, the one thing that's helping Russia, obviously, the sanctions didn't really work out that well. As the global South gets stronger, as their economy grows, this will keep Russia in the game as far as keeping them stable. If this situation happened, 20 years ago, when Russia was still in chaos after the fall of the Soviet Union, before China was where it's at now and the rest of the global South, yeah, this strategy, suckering Russia into Ukraine, might have caused the collapse of Russia. But I think we underestimated just how much the rest of the world has grown up and aren't, again, following along behind the United States. And we look at China as being the little boy to be lectured, and we try to treat them that way. And China says, we're not interested. We're going to do us, and you guys can go pound sand. And of course, China understands that Taiwan is the next situation that the United States is working on as far as causing instability in the Pacific, who try to, as we say openly, try to contain China economically and militarily. And I do kind of find it funny how we think that it's our job to contain another country, their economic growth. I could understand if we're talking about the military and military expansion. Maybe we have a reason to want to stop that. But if a country is economically growing, that's good, right? Why is that a bad thing? Why do we want to control their economic capabilities? But again, that goes back to our neocons and our neoliberals and their worldview. And their worldview is a zero sum game where another country's success is something that's taken away from the United States and their power. So that's their game. It's a zero sum game, and you play that game. Um, it's in the future with China and Russia, that's going to be a problem, and that could lead to some sort of direct confrontation. And of course, direct confrontation between the United States, Russia, or China means that we all get incinerated in in an atomic blast. So we need to change our thinking from a zero sum game to mutual cooperation. Wouldn't that be grand? Where we all get along and a rising tide raises all boats. That would be fantastic, but probably not going to happen, but I can dream. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.